So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's In the Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross, the Curatorial Manager of Exhibitions and Emerging Artists Program at MOAD. And it's my great pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with visual artist Nyame O. Brown, who's quite popular and quite famous in the Oakland school district, it would appear. Before we get to the conversation, I just want to go through a few housekeeping things, as I mentioned before, but for those of you just now joining us, if you wouldn't mind writing in to the chat where you're joining us from, that would be great. It's been really exciting to see people from all over the country and all over the world attending our programs. MOAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard, join MOAD staff members as we visit with some of our favorite artists in their studios to see what they're currently working on and how their work is changing as a result of the quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios. We will follow all talks with an audience Q&A, so please feel free to leave your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box at any time throughout the program. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up. You can also go back and watch all of our past talks on the MOAD YouTube channel. This series is made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, our wonderful MOAD members, and viewers like you. Thank you all for your continued support. MOAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and so many others who've lost their lives at the hand, and who've lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We also acknowledge the death of Jonathan Price this past weekend, who was tased and fatally shot by a Texas police officer after intervening and resolving a conflict between a couple. We want to acknowledge that as this list of names continues to grow, we will continue to say them and will continue to bring awareness in the fight for real justice for Black Americans. We'd also like to deliver a land acknowledgement. Most of us are settler immigrants or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this series or any MOAD programming, please consider donating to MOAD Online. Donations of any amount are always welcome, and a link for where you can donate will be dropped in the chat. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured artist, Nyame O. Brown. Nyame is a visual artist born in San Francisco, now living and working in the Bay Area. He is an Afrofuturist installation artist working in the media of painting, drawing, and cut paper. Brown's work addresses the Black imagination as a space for new ways to perceive diaspora, not just through unity and similarities, but looking at the dynamics of difference to further comprehend diaspora. He uses the folklore, cultural practices, and symbols from the diaspora to make paintings of contemporary Black mythologies. Nyame has been an artist in residence at Headlands Center for Contemporary Art, Bemis Center for Contemporary in Omaha, Nebraska. The Malcolm X Memorial Foundation worked with Nyame to create a site-specific public art piece for display at the foundation. He made an homage and double portrait of Malcolm X and the artist Jack Whitten. Nyame participated for the third time in the international platform showcasing cutting-edge art from across the Black Diaspora-Prizm Art Fair 2018 in Miami, held at Mana Contemporary. He was part of a group show curated by William Cordova, the transphysics we knew about. Recent accolades include the Emerging Artist Solo Show at the Museum of the African Diaspora, which we'll get to in a bit, Prizm Art Fair 2016, curated by Mikhaile Solomon and William Cordova for Miami Art Week, and attending Theaster Gates Black Artist Retreat in August. In February 2017, Nyame, in collaboration with Carrie Mae Weems, participated in the Symposium, The Interrogation of Forms, The Changing Culture in America at the Park Ave Armory in New York City. Brown received his BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1993 and MFA from Yale School of Art and Architecture in 1997. He completed the Joan Mitchell Center Artist in Residence program in New Orleans and is a recipient of the Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award 2003 and the Richard Dreyhouse Foundation Individual Artist 2002. Solo exhibitions include West Virginia University Museum, August 2012, John Henry's Adventures in a Post-Black World at the Hearst Museum in 2013, Notes from the Studio are Afronauts, April 2013 at St. Mary's College of California. Other group shows include Heroes and Villains at the San Francisco Public Library. Naeem is also the 2020 TOSA Studio Award winner. That is quite the impressive bio, Mr. Brown.
Hey,
I just want to say thank you for being here and welcome.
sure. No, I'm really excited to be here. Really appreciate you guys inviting me. You guys are a really important institution, you know, and I also just want to say, Elena, I just want to say thank you for taking a little bit of time to make space to, again, to talk about the loss of the brother who got shot yesterday. And I think just talking about land rights, I think, again, clearing a space to do that before kind of getting off on this little journey we're going to be on in terms of the studio visits. So I really appreciate that, because that's of very utmost importance, especially in light of some of the topics that may kind of come up here in the studio. But man, for sure, I really appreciate that. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, we've had a lot of internal conversations about it as to how to incorporate that into our programming. And I think, as you say, it is really important to kind of clear that space because nothing should be business as usual. And I think this is one of those spaces where we can acknowledge not only the work that we do, but also who we are as human beings. And so it feels important to kind of do that work and lay that groundwork first before we jump into the meatier stuff. So I also thank you for appreciating and acknowledging that. That's something that at MOA we've tried to do throughout these past few months of quarantine. Yeah.
Sure. Well, much appreciated.
So with that, how are you? And might I ask, where are you right now? Where are you in virtual space?
Sure, I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. So like I said, I'm super excited about being here. I'm over in East Oakland. I live over here in Fruitvale. And in my studio, which is I have a live workspace. So the main home is in the front there. My studio space is here in the back. So I'm just kind of chilling here in the studio to greet you guys today, and hopefully give you a tour maybe a little later.
In a little bit. You don't want to do so now?
We could do a little bit now.
I like to start out that way just to give people a sense like that they're actually in your space. But we can also hold off if you want to tidy some things up first.
Fine. Let me just go ahead, and I'm just gonna take advantage of the share screen here, and I'm gonna see if I could share something with you guys here. And let's see if you guys are able to. One sec to connect, I believe. All right.
There you are.
This is good. Let me go ahead and show you guys the space here. I'm transitioning right now to another space. This is pretty tight quarters here where all the studio dust kind of builds up.
Yeah.
Like you were saying a little bit earlier, Elena, I'm a recent recipient of the TOSA Award, which is a local award which supports Bay Area artists. What it does is it gives me a one year free studio space at Minnesota Street Projects.
Oh, and yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and just end that really quick. Unless you guys want to see more there. I'll show you one other thing that's kind of fun. I'm going to move this light really quick. You guys didn't hear that light fall? That's okay. These are a series of invisible drawings I'm working on. They're based on Kevin Jones, who's an African-American writer who had created a series of works where he was talking about imaginative books that held these kind of dirty kind of things, or maybe these bad ideas and that we imagine as African-Americans. And it was a way for me kind of expanding a little bit on his thoughts. But also I just wanted to show these because the way that I also kind of respond a lot to literature plays a big role when kind of developing my artwork. So I'm just going to unshare this for 1 second. Okay.
So in moving,
like a little quick shot of the studio there.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. I personally, I always enjoy seeing an artist studio and just how these things, you know, we're so used to seeing the finished product either in the museum or in the gallery space, but seeing kind of where they begin, I think is really interesting for understanding an artist's practice. In terms of moving to your new studio at Minnesota Street, are there any projects in particular that you're excited to either continue or to start fresh in that space?
I'm working on a series of scroll drawings. Excuse me one sec, so I'll open the window. A series of scroll drawings, and they're about 3 by 15 feet. So I'm really excited to kind of have them in the space that would be large enough to put them out. Because one of the things in working in a space like this, and I think a lot of artists are able to relate, is that you create work and it may be part of a series, kind of expanding on certain ideas that you've developed. But when working in a smaller space, you have to make them and then put them away. So you're not able to really kind of see them all together and to really kind of create the dialogue that starts to happen between the work when you could see it. So I think for me, that's going to be a really exciting part, is seeing the work that I'm currently working on, like the series, seeing it up on the walls and seeing how they respond to kind of one another. And so I could kind of see like, oh, you know, this one needs a little bit of that, like that one needs a little bit of this kind of in there. Because I think that's organically, I think that's how the work kind of grows. And actually it grows stronger, because without being able to see the other pieces when they're hidden, like when I'm working in a smaller space, it's like a notepad, you know, if I kind of flip the page over, I kind of lose that information. I have to kind of keep flipping back, as opposed to if I had them all laid out on the wall. Right, and I could kind of reference everything very clearly, you know, and in the moment. So I think that's what it is. So again, these large scroll paintings, being able to see them all together and bounce from one another, from like one to the other, and seeing those develop along with the large paintings, because they also kind of have a relationship to one another in some of the visuals that are happening in the scroll paintings, to some of the visuals that are happening in the large kind of blackboard paintings. So they kind of go back and forth, and I think to have a chance to do that will be really exciting.
Yeah. Would you say, has quarantine slowed down your process at all, sped it up, or kept it about the same? Have you found it to be a generative time, or have you found there to be like a lot of stasis in sort of in the way you've been working over the last few months?
It's been good, because it's really kind of been a good time for me to really simply dig in on stuff that's already habitual, you know, in terms of like how I kind of go to the canvas already. So I've been able to actually work a little quicker. And that was also a goal. You know, when I finished up at Headlands Center for the Arts, one of the things I was doing there was there for a really kind of short amount of time. And so I kind of had to work really condensed, like really pack it in. And so that also helped me to kind of practice like skill that I think that sometimes you develop when you're in an undergraduate, sometimes in a graduate program as a young artist, that skill to really create work, man. Don't second guess it, but really make it, really generate a lot of this stuff. And so that felt really good. And so I want to continue that, like stay in contact with that energy. But there's also an urgency. I feel like there's more of an urgency to get this stuff out, and to move to some of my other ideas too. You know, so I feel like it's created a space to have a little bit more urgency, but it's definitely picked up the process. Like I'm tracking it more.
So you've, in a sense, you've taken that residency, it sounds like you've almost taken that residency experience and recreated it for yourself in your home environment during this time, that kind of ritual of getting up, getting it out, you know, and producing. For
sure. I think we were talking a little bit about this before we started the real kind of conversation on camera, which was that, you know, I thought about some ways I think about it, like kind of Tai Chi, which is going to describe as kind of a moving meditation, is that it also allows me to do that, to kind of like shift out of some of the intensity of the moments here. So it kind of clears out a space for me by being able to kind of work. So that's, I think, another kind of, that's what drives me to get to the canvas too. Like, oh, I'm going to go draw because this kind of need to clear out this space. I'm not on autopilot because it's not that. Right. So that's why I kind of use the metaphor of like Tai Chi, because I'm aware of what's happening and I'm moving with intent, but I'm not focused on all these outside kind of forces that are very clear to us, you know, in society right now.
So I want to take a moment to show a quick video that you shared with me, because I think it kind of elucidates some of your process and kind of the imaginative and generative nature of your work. Do you want to introduce this video at all before I show it, or would you prefer me to just push play?
Sure. It's called Call and Response, and it was based on this idea of really looking at how the aesthetic of call and response, we see it throughout the African diaspora. It's such a strong aesthetic, and it's a way to kind of really, it makes everything it's active. If nothing is passive, performances, art, it's not a passive thing. It's you have to engage it. And so I thought about how to start to bring that to the visual art practice, because I always think a lot about and of recent, thinking a lot about this idea of not just looking at the Western canon as art practice, but looking outside that practice and like really looking specifically at our aesthetic kind of practices as it relates to art, and that call and response being one. So this was an example of me approaching a young brother who's an audio engineer as well as an MC in Omaha. And I wanted to ask him about this idea of basically doing a rhyme battle against my visual art piece to create this idea of activating a space between them. And him actually really rhyming, battling face to face, not facing me, but that was it, because I was the one rhyming and giving the first call, like, yo, here it is, what you got? And so he was like, all right. And he, you'll see in the video, he was a little surprised. He'll tell you some bit of his experience.
Okay.
But that's where it started.
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Sure. And just also too, as a kind of a context, for me, hip hop is really a great way. It's a way for me that got introduced a lot to kind of, again, like poetry and idea of metaphor and larger than life persona. So it plays a really strong role in kind of what I do. And so that's why it was, want to use it as a vehicle for storytelling in this particular situation. All right, I'll see you in a second. Peace.
Can you hear it okay?
Let's see.
No.
Maybe turn it up just a little bit. It's a little low.
Okay. Feeling good? You guys are looking great. You need coffee or anything? So, I've been in the Bemis for contemporary arts multiple times, but, this time was definitely the most significant, and it felt so, I don't know if secretive is the right word, but I was like, open the back door, you go up these staircases, and all of a sudden you just feel this energy of like, oh, I'm about to walk into something that's like real and dope.
Oh, wow. So this is a piece where I'll move through these things so you can get up close to it. But one of the things I was thinking about, man, was how the idea came about is I kind of wanted an MC to go ahead and tell me what their interpretation of what they thought the story was. I thought about you flowing to talk about it, but I was like, well, wait a minute, could it be actually more interesting if you actually were responding to the piece? And thinking about it like an MC battle. And also think about the idea of call and response. And so in this case, I'm putting out the call and you will be the response. So my work is the call, because I'm not gonna flow, but this is my flow. And so you go, okay, so I was like, okay, you said what you gotta say, man. All right, let me go ahead and do my thing. And so you would be, again, directly in front of the pieces.
MC's name is Chicken DB.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, what you got? All right, I got this,
When I
and
first
so I thought about
approached him about this.
So it's kind of like, again, you're responding. And so what that does is actually, I felt like it starts to make the piece very interactive. And I had thought about other performances and things that would also possibly happen around the piece, but I thought very much about that, the one of you responding, that call and response.
Yeah, call and response, yeah. Call and response, yeah. Call and response, yeah. Call and response. Check it, yeah. Call and response, yeah. Call and response. My DNA, yeah, the DNA is basic, face it. Yeah. Call and response, called, and I hope they respond and spawn out. Assistance for my mom, sister, family, and on and on. And furthermore, further my lawn, my turf, my world, whatever you call it, the earth of God, the earth of God, the earth of the Lord, DNA, yeah, the DNA, generation of the genetic correlation between the Africans now and the Africans taken. Yeah, it's basic. Call and response, call and I call and response. Yeah, make me a patient. I don't trust what the doctor's saying until he recognizes the hatred amongst the patiently waiting families of a disrupted nation. It's basic, face it, just face it. I hand them the mirrors, but they reflection breaks it. People read the paper, hear me say just, why do the wide range of people telling lies and dangers come for the true God's angels? Yeah, it's basic, motherfucker, face it. Yeah, it's basic, yeah. It's the DNA, yeah, the DNA, yeah, the DNA. God body probably had a good party. Yeah, when he made our fate, yeah, the DNA, yeah, the DNA. We on the dinner plate, yeah. DNA, yeah, our DNA, yeah. Why the DNA on the dinner plate? Let's go, yeah, we got gold, history in all the modes. Other God body is chose, the arms and the legs and head. Yeah, rest. Yeah, I see the painting, and the first thing I'm seeing is the different depths and different like planes of dimension within it. I don't know the proper terms to say, but once I saw that, I could just really feel how this was almost like it's capturing whatever the visual of how a mind and a timeline would think. I just could really see the panning and feel the pan of it, and how it just like is just very cohesive to the way like a mind would organize memories or just history within a mind.
That, yeah, it just took me away. I mean, it was dope watching the performance. In fact, it was tough because I wanted to almost be in front of the piece, but I felt like, he needed to be there alone in front, confront the work. But man, I almost wanted to be in the same space because it felt so good, But yeah, it was just, and again, that unexpected thing was like, man, I had no idea what this would yield or how it would feel until that happened. And to me, what it did, it changed the space. It wasn't that it was a performance space now. It just created a full richness. When me and Chikadibia spoke a little bit afterwards and thinking about these ideas, that it could be even, so many other layers to it too, when thinking about this idea of even dance, being part of it. And thinking of other possibilities it was really, I have to say, it was a nice, magical, open moment where I couldn't have envisioned what happened. I mean, it just had me smiling from ear to ear because it unlocked all these other possibilities too,
Call and respond, call and respond.
Okay.
So I think so. So the work in that particular video is also an example of kind of the scroll work that you were talking about, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That was it. Totally. It was inspired from because again, I mean, I really consider myself very much a storyteller, and so I always looking at different modes of storytelling. I'd come across a show at the Asian Art Museum here in SF, and it was they had some East Indian scrolls that were really amazing that were used for storytelling, but they incorporated different layers. So there was a narrator, a storyteller, but then the storyteller was accompanied by a musician. So again, like when I talked about some of those influences of hip hop, for me, I think about, again, rhyming is like storytelling, and so it's like the musician is the DJ. And so to me, when I saw the scroll and read about how it was laid out, it just made sense to me that would be the contemporary form of a Black oral tradition, would be like a hip hop MC, like flowing my story. In that particular situation, I wanted to be really like call and response, like responsive in terms of, and if you listen, it was really funny. At first, he was kind of like describing it. And then it's like, after that, he starts actually trying to respond to what he's seeing as opposed to just describing what he's seeing. And that was when I felt like I hit pay dirt. And that was kind of what I was really curious about in terms of that aesthetic, that call and response, as opposed to him just telling him the story. I'm like, okay, like flow the story. Like, I'm gonna tell you what the story is exactly, like you flow it. So it was, again, trying to hit that point of like, how do you make this stuff not passive? Again, thinking about, again, other African practices like jazz or
Right.
the blues, how it's like people would dance to these things, but then as it kind of evolved into like our contemporary culture, people sit down very politely and watch jazz and blues musicians. And it's not really, not that it's not meant for that, but that's, it's shifted it from being active to passive.
Yeah, and there's less of the kind of the bodily expression that
Exactly.
we're used to, like sound and movement and that kind of like visceral. feeling, that kind of almost Stendhal-like syndrome that you can have in front of a work of art that helps you better understand it.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's you're involved in it. It's not just like a casual walk past the artwork on the wall. It's like, oh, okay, like this isn't. You're asking something of me to kind of really activate it too.
So that brings me to a question I have about I guess how you, since so much of you, and I'll show a few images in a moment, but so much of your work is installation based, or you have similar to kind of this call and response moment that you had with the MC, these like constructed environments. How has, just with the current reality of shelter in place and with COVID and everything, how has that shifted the way you envision the presentation of this work? And since it feels like with so many, even with your drawings, like the mark making is so intentional, and obviously that experience is going to look very different on a screen than it would in person. And so how have you shifted in thinking a bit about the way you present your work? And also, do you see that as being more challenging, or do you see that as being like an exciting possibility for how your work is going to open up in the future?
Sure. I think about it. I think it's definitely presented some hurdles, but I haven't seen it as a intense obstacle. But I have thought about, again, like shifting perspective again of like how to use like the tools of now that we're kind of more online, and to use that maybe to better. Use it as a different way to present the work as opposed to how it was before. And so one of the things I had entertained was with the scrolls is that it's funny, like looking at old tech as opposed to kind of new tech. But when I was younger, they had these animated shorts where it was really low tech, where they would just kind of pan in on a drawing or either pull out and then maybe scroll across. And it would just have a narrator. So for me, I thought about using my scrolls the same way. So again, being a narrator, zooming in on certain key figures and moments, and narrating this kind of like massive, like mega story I've been doing, as well as maybe doing some shorts next to pieces, right next to some of the paintings, and same thing, kind of exist as a narrator and explain maybe what's happening in this particular scene of like this massive allegory or narrative, to in one way kind of propagate the story, just like just like someone would have to propagate the story of Little Red Riding Hood, right? It's like you tell it over and over. Someone tells it at a library to little kids. Some grandmother tells it to their kid. So I thought, like, again, using social media, like posting these stories of me talking next to my work, or that short animation, as a way to kind of activate the work. I know it's old tech, but I like animation, and it's like, and again, I'm not really I don't really want to draw all these because I feel like it's already there, and I feel like this way might be a really cool way to do it with that kind of old tech animation. What kind of
low tech, or old tech, I should say, not low tech necessarily. What kind of old tech animation have you experimented with?
I did little flip books, but what I was talking about is really just that, like taking my handheld iPhone and kind of zooming in on a character, like pulling back while doing the narration, scrolling across. As opposed to it being like flipping, towards it being like full movement and stuff like that, but like that.
Have you ever considered creating some of the characters as miniatures almost, and like in that kind of animation, like almost building a little set, because so many of, as we're seeing like kind of this work and some of your other works, they feel so three-dimensional in certain ways. Have you ever experimented with creating them in like
I was having some conversations around that with a former student and visual artist here in the Bay Area. I was talking to him about, he works in the field of game design, my friend Ernesto, and we were talking about that, like the idea of working on one of these, like creating an artifact from the story, because thinking as a storyteller and creating this massive story of these new Black myths, one of the things that kind of, I feel like, solidifies stories sometimes, or tweaks them so they create a hyper reality that's like a liminal space between the real and the mythical or the imagined, is when you have artifacts that come from these stories, right? Like in a Catholic church, you might find a reliquary. you know, the bone knuckle of Saint Augustine. So I felt like the same thing could kind of do that with my own kind of mythologies. And so we had thought about like creating maybe a 3D, one of these maybe boots, like you see on the leg of this John Henry character kind of laid out on the table. So maybe making one of these like a 3D printed one of those, painted up really nice and fine. And of course, thinking about that, like you mentioned, like things like toy culture,
Yeah.
these really amazing kind of plastic models that I see people have, like, you know, for Marvel and DC stuff, but using that on my own objects. And then within a conversation with another artist, thinking about making it, like physically actually making them, because that also gives a different kind of quality to it, right? Maybe even solidifies it more in reality, as opposed to it being just an artifact of contemporary culture.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I've kind of thought like of a few of those elements. Like one aspect of the scroll is that I want to make a book of it and actually have a small album inside of it. And the idea was based on an old comic of like Captain America that had like a plastic album that you could play. So it told the whole story. So you could kind of just look at the images and play the album. But I also want to do the same thing with my scrolls, is make an illustrated book with no text, but have like the album inside.
Like an illuminated manuscript almost.
Totally, but like have this album in the back so you could play it. It would tell you the story. So you would just kind of scroll through it and kind of peep it. So again, but the fascination with old things like vinyl and old kind of technology. So you have to work a little harder to get to the story. So it's not just like, oh, this is a greatly designed book and oh, it's your cool story and you've kind of written it all out. But more like, there's still a little bit of like, you got to find a record player. You got to kind of set up your place, the mood, to get it right, to hear the story. Because again, those are the things I desire when people tell stories to me as well.
Yeah. So this investment in some of these analog pieces of expression in terms of, you know, vinyl, or thinking about even bookmaking in scrolls, obviously, you know, is there anything older in terms of art history than like, you know, other than cave paintings perhaps, than like the idea of the scroll? But you're also combining them with these imagined worlds, these imagined futures that you've created. And this, I think there's obviously there's a lot of consideration in your work throughout all of the bodies of work that you present in this idea of futurity. But you combine these kind of Afrofuturist imagined spaces and world building with this almost like very tactile, worldly, grounded, analog kind of technologies or systems or mediums. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see those two things in relationship, and also just kind of how futurity plays out in the work that you do.
Sure. I think part of it, like, because it's like a couple things like there. I think for me, looking back at culture, almost like the idea like Sankofa, right? Looking back as a way to understand the path forward. I feel like that's kind of a real kind of idea for me in terms of like looking back at kind of culture, the African diaspora culture, and looking at like, how do you represent that in the future, like that being a goal, like carving out a space for that, right? And thinking about what is kind of like these future representations of kind of Blackness, like that's kind of that becomes a certain kind of drive. And to develop that, like when visualizing that, I feel like part of it is that like looking back, looking at some of the things that are like across the diaspora that are amazing and no one has ever even kind of thought about as being jumping off points to think about future representations of Blackness. And then also to thinking of that even further, like I also kind of visualize like, how do I position myself to think about Blackness in such a way that no one's ever thought about it, and totally keeps expanding how we kind of think about Blackness, you know? I think kind of the second part in terms of futurism, like I think, in fact, I kind of wrote down your question. I'm just actually going to refer to it here really quick. Yeah. I know I saw it because I knew it was like one that was a really good one.
Yeah, I think I'm really fascinated, you know, and as I mentioned in the question I sent to you, because I think it is a conversation that we're having, that I think a lot of us culturally are having right now because of, you know, the last few months, like in this feeling of 2020 being this almost like apocalyptic year of like major massive upheaval in terms, and not just in terms of like the pandemic, but also in terms of, you know, the violence of this past summer, also thinking about the upcoming election, and everyone's kind of looking to both feeling a little bit helpless, but also looking to the future as like kind of maybe like our saving grace is like, you know, trying to balance feeling helpless and also feeling hopeful. And so I'm just curious, but since your work has been so invested in these kinds of ideas for so long, I think that,
you know, it's I think this also relates to the conversation we had before we were on camera too, is I feel like for me, imagination is such a major catalyst. And I was referring to someone who made a quote talking about how African-American intellectuals were referring to this idea that, you know, as a group of people here in African-Americans, that we so long have been in such survival mode that we almost use all of our thinking as like just, it's like proletariat, it's like basic survival. And so the idea of imagination has really been pushed to the side, right? To kind of go for these key things, to really make certain key survival kind of things. And to me, the imagination is such an amazing catalyst because it creates, you imagine new possibilities. So that for me is kind of my investment in the type of imagery that uses or refers to kind of a futurism. And I think that's why, again, my ideas kind of reside there, is because it's ways to be a catalyst for imagination, the Black imagination, to create these new possibilities, ways of representing ourselves, thinking about ourselves, our situations. But the imagination needs to be engaged to do that. And that's why I think, again, the images I try to create so in some ways so fantastic, right? Is to kind of make people go, oh, because also those were the triggers that triggered me, like when I was a kid, when looking at science fiction or comic books, but not seeing myself reflected back. So now it's like, oh, well, I could totally make myself reflected back in so many different possibilities, right? So I think that's kind of the investment. And also the as it relates kind of the contemporary dialogue is, again, decentralizing the Western canon being such a hard force visually, and creating new ways of seeing like the Black diaspora, and thinking more really specifically about even body comportment, how like there's certain specific things to Black body comportment, and thinking also in a Pan-African way that I want people to see that in the work, like other Africans, like some Jamaican Catholics, like, oh man, that's like how my grandmother holds her body, or like, oh, that's how my uncle holds his body, someone like maybe from Martinique. And the reason why is because there is a specificity to body comportment that's different. And why I bring that up is to how, as an art student, I always know about the odalisque, Aang's odalisque, or the term contrapposto, right? The weight shifting here and then shifting here to the hips and the shoulders. These are body comportments that are completely European, but they're etched in your brain as you learn these things as a developing art, as an artist, even if you're an artist of color. So I feel like there's lots to be invested in this idea of creating a whole visual language as a Black figurative artist that starts to focus on this body comportment specificity, right? And so that's kind of, again, that investment in how I see the future is creating new body comportments, new kind of narratives to inspire imagination, but also so that, again, Africans from all parts of diaspora go, oh man, that's like the Black masking Indians you've got there, but that's not them. And that's totally what we do in Martinique. We totally do that one dance and we hold our bodies like that. How does it, but so it's familiar, but not familiar.
Right.
You know?
It's familiar, but also new, completely new.
Exactly.
So I think that actually is a really great segue into another question I have for you in terms of the Black myth, which is, you know, this body of work that you've been working on, and really like the stories that you generate, these narratives you generate in multiple bodies of works of yours, some of which obviously draw from science fiction and draw from different works of literature, different popular culture. But really thinking about, one, I would love it if you could describe one of the Black myths that you were working on in particular. And then two, just thinking about myth as myth making and world building as kind of as activities, as practice, and how you define myth making, and how, for me, what's interesting is this idea of how myth making is, if it is, somehow different than history, and how you see those two things either in opposition to one another or actually far more aligned than we necessarily think about it. So it's like kind of two big questions, but.
Sure. There's a piece that I just finished up. It's called Cakewalk 3000. And it's a brother that has a mandrill mask on, but it looks like a hybrid animal. He's walking like on snakes. It's like really kind of over the top. But the character comes from when I first heard Signifying Monkey, which was a toast that Dolomite did, the African-American comedian. He got very famous for it. He didn't invent it, but he got very famous for it. And so after I heard it, I was just like fascinated. I think, in fact, I asked my grandmother about it. She was like, "Oh yeah, it's really good." So she just kept telling me it's really good. And so then I found an African-American folklore book, and they had it in there, word for word. They had the whole thing, the Signifying Monkey. And it was a badass monkey. He was badass. He put the lion to shame. And so I was fascinated with that. And this painting became, the monkey character almost like felt like a nuncy too, because he got himself into trouble to only get himself out of trouble, to prove how amazingly brilliant he was. He had bravado. He was amazing. So it's like, I was like, man, I want to totally, how do you use this character? And I also thought very much like, in terms of, again, like the story, there were metaphors in it. And I thought about my character existing like that. And just like when I talk about like hip hop, there's so many different visual metaphors, or oral metaphors, is I thought like, how could I make the Signifying Monkey just like this crazy like poem where he's like a bad motherfucker, right? He's bad, he's cold-blooded, but he does run into some troubles. Especially if I now bring it into reality, which is thinking about masks that we wear in the culture as African Americans, because you have to behave one way in larger society, you behave a different way at home. As a Black professional, it's a crazy balancing act, like having these different masks on, being part of two different worlds. And thinking about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, there's this element of invisibility, right? And when people see you, sometimes it's only cloaked in these stereotypes and archetypes, false anthropology of like Africans being related to like, simians. And so that became like the yoke of this character. Like his monkeyness was really this mask that could be protecting him, it could be concealing or obfuscating who he really was as a human. So I tried to really build in all these other kind of elements, thinking about my Black experience, but the Black experience, as African American, as a professional, and how this being invisible, not invisible, how you walk down by these different yokes of archetypes and stereotypes, and how, man, it's hard. It's hard. So I had this dude balancing on these snakes, juggling knives. So I tried to really look at like the simple kind of certain aspects of that tale. And then like allegorical paintings from the 17th and 16th century, look at contemporary social political culture, my experience as a Black person, and now meld those things together to kind of make this new thing, this new visual, But the visual was trying to hold up to this oral tradition of African American folklore. Like, again, the oral one as like when telling the story, but also to the more contemporary one that I was familiar with was like hip hop. So it also had to have that bravado, my guy has like chains on, he's got like dookie ropes, he's got a microphone. So those have to be part of it too, as a contemporary storyteller, is putting in the elements that relate to contemporary culture. So Signifying Monkey.
Yeah.
For sure I would. Let's see. Well, that's a great piece you guys got there. You'll have to go ahead and ask me, and so the other aspects of the question, you'll have to remind me.
Yeah, so the other aspect of the question is just how you so myth making seems, in my estimation, myth making, and especially as we think about how American history, or how any history, how Western civilization has been written and has been transmitted for hundreds of years, is, in my mind, it's sort of myth making as well. There's like a kind of there's an investment in certain ideologies and certain stories specifically that get regurgitated time and time again, that, you know, kind of hold this weight, this cultural weight. And so thinking about the idea of myth making and history, and the work that you're doing as being, do you think about it as being subverting some of that? And do you see it as being in some of the work that you do as being a challenge ultimately to the way in which we transmit history, the way we tell these stories, by telling new and almost fantastical tales, but positioning them in such a way that gives them more weight?
Yeah, I would say it is. It is a subversive act because it's trying to decentralize like the Western kind of canon and saying that those are the only stories, you know, because there's so many stories. It's like my stories like coming from just being, you know, a kid from around the way, and like, you know, people not thinking about my stories, but it's like, man, I know I got a lot to say. I know my imagination is so rich. I know I got something to tell you, you know? So yeah, there's a way of, again, really kind of working in a subversive way, kind of decentralizing, again, all these kind of Western, again, whether it's like body comportment, whether it's like just the same story, but there's also, I want to have the agency. I mean, I give myself the agency to create new stories. Like I think it's Amos Tutolo who wrote like My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. Just this idea to, instead of also just having these old stories, like create new ones. So the core is based on a cultural kind of like, for me, like an African-American folktale, but I also and that's the core of it, and that's the tradition part, the Black Diaspora tradition part of it, is that it's based on this folk tradition and story. But my job as a contemporary like Black artist and storyteller is to make it contemporary, to make it fit for now. And to do that is to take ownership, and to, like we see in the African diaspora with music like jazz and blues, is I riff off of it. So I kind of make my own unique thing while still being able to jive with the rest of the groove and the melody. So I've got my own unique thing I've done, but I'm still part of the melody, meaning so the core is the traditional folk kind of practice, but I've tried to re-envision it in this new way that starts to create that space we've been talking about, of visualizing ourselves in the future, like Blackness in the future, and all these different kind of intonations, you know? So again, I kind of feel like that becomes a lot of the drive, you know, is again, is trying to use it as a, yes, like just for like very much so. And I think the need for new stories is important so that we don't keep circling around the old ones, you know, taking agency to kind of make new ones. And the new ones could be as lavish and lush as we want them to be. And they kind of add more to, again, like I was saying, like this idea of diaspora, because it keeps adding more to diversity. It doesn't at all into anything monolithic. It starts to kind of create more of this kind of larger.
It's an opening up as opposed to a siphoning off and a closing. Yeah.
Completely.
So one of the bodies of work that I want to be sure that we highlight is work that you presented here at MOAD during the Emerging Artist Program, because I think it speaks to both you as an so something I've noticed in a lot of your work, but also specifically in that installation, is that you ultimately created this classroom, this imagined classroom from that takes inspiration from this Samuel Delaney work. And so thinking about your work also as an artist, obviously, but also as an educator, and specifically of young children, young artists, a lot of your work seems to reference education and pedagogy as a practice of myth making and world building as well. And so I was wondering how you see your role as both an artist and educator as playing a central role in envisioning and shaping the future and future possibilities. And also, I guess, how you see the role of education itself, like the role of the pedagogical as being necessary for envisioning these possibilities as being part of that practice.
Sure. You know, I think of it a little bit like this. I remember there's one capoeista, Afro-Brazilian martial artist named Cobra Mansa. He's a master teacher. I remember him saying that he had no idea if any of his students would become masters, but he was flattered when it happened. And I kind of feel like the same way. It's like I have no idea what student I'm going to have that's going to go through my classroom and become like a master teacher, instructor, you know, a professional artist. So when it happens, I'm like totally amazed. I feel like sometimes the strongest force that I have is really working hard within my practice to create these images that, and I hate being kind of repetitive, but that start to really take these leaps in how we think about future ideas about Blackness, that people just don't even kind of think of, haven't even really kind of thought of. And pedagogically, how I think a lot of my studio work kind of overlaps is that I definitely don't try to keep them separate in terms of like how I do research, mm-hmm. how I make artistic associative kind of leaps between like, you know, African hair, looking also like architecture, you know, when I'm talking to students. It's like, so I allow there to be really like a lot of kind of crossover in terms of pedagogy that way. And I also think trying to introduce my students to like these ideas and could be, you know, for example, we looked at an Afrofuturist text one day, like a manifesto. And so I talked them, they created like a drawing based on that. And that was some of the work was actually presented in that show at Moab, like it was on a pinned up board. And that was kind of amazing because I was the first time I did that, but I start to see clearly how by introducing the things, my practices in terms of trying to question some of the things that maybe I learned within the Western kind of canon as an artist, but questioning it through my visual art. Mm-hmm. Some of those questions I was doing would be great to bring up in the classroom, mm-hmm. and mainly because no one's asking them. And it's also doing that thing of kind of not just focusing on the Western canon. It's having students kind of ask these more interesting questions like, well, why don't I see myself reflect? Like, yeah, why aren't there like Asian futurist paintings in American art? Or why don't I see Latino kind of like, you know, Quetzalcoatl hybrid space characters, you know, in paintings? Like, why don't I really kind of see that? Or maybe they are there, but why aren't they part of the dialogue, or why are they not focused on? So I feel like those are some of the things. I'm always surprised though occasionally about some of the small things that happen. Like when I see students who will exhibit like maybe certain skills that are kind of taught in class, you know, I'll be like, oh man, you picked that up? Like, oh, no way. You know, but I think for me, the way that I feel like I could affect the strongest about representations of Blackness within the future, ideas about the importance of our own particular cultural body and comportment, is really the hard work of like making these paintings. You know, I think Carrie James Marshall kind of said it really well. It's like he wants to litter our history of images of Black people because there's a lack of them. So I think by creating more of my imagery, that's what's going to really push, you know, and that's also the reservoir of the work that's left is what's going to also influence future Black artists to be like, yo, this dude's work, that's, yes, like that stuff's weird. Like that is weird. I like it. And I want to push that even further.
Right, like a jumping off point to ask new questions and to imagine new
totally, because that's where I feel like the power of it is. You know, there are things that happen pedagogically, like again allowing the thought process and elements of my research to flow into the classroom to ask certain questions, and again, like trying to question like the Western practice of visual art, or just have students pause a minute to think about that.
Yeah. I'm going to stop this really quickly, and I'm going to open it up to see if there are any additional questions. But I guess before I do that, are there any shows or residencies you have coming up that you'd like to plug? I want to give you an opportunity to.
I'm doing this to TOSA. I'm on the TOSA Awards. I will be in San Francisco at the Minnesota Street Projects. I'm there for a year. I received the honorarium from them and really excited for that to kind of start. Couple prospects, Kehinde Wiley's residency, which is out in Senegal, Dakar.
Oh yeah.
Black Rock, that's something I applied for, just kind of something in the works, looking towards that. I have a show coming up at the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago this summer. There's another show that's going to be coming at the Marin Museum of Contemporary Art. The show that was curated by Judith Jenkins. That's going to be about 12 different artists. I'm sorry, I don't know the title. That's going to be coming up soon in December. And currently at the, no, actually, I think those are my main things. Those are the main things. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in the works. I think that's it. And Prizm Art Fair, Prizm Art Fair 2020.
Yeah, I have a question for you in terms of, obviously visually we see these long narratives that you've created, but do you write short stories as well? Do you write short stories? Do you write speculative fiction?
Yes, I remember that was one of your questions you had asked, and it's something actually that I'm leaning into now because I was really afraid of it. I felt very weak with my writing ability, and so I felt like I didn't want to do that, and for some reason I kept steering away from it. But I'm realizing that I'm going to have to, and mainly because I love literature, and just like I was saying earlier, sometimes I work from literature. So I thought, like, well, one of the things that may force me to do is, in my brain, things are always mushy. I mean, they always are malleable. They can move around and shift. If I write these things down, in some ways, maybe it holds my feet to the fire, like it holds me to it, maybe, and so I thought it would be an interesting way to kind of create certain type of narrative or visual parameters, so, to kind of like give these guide rails for it, as opposed to it always being so kind of maybe moving and open, because that's how a lot of the story exists, because a lot of it has a lot to do with me, my experiences. And also I thought that the myth would seem amazing too, in terms of the growth of it and being part of me, because it makes me implicit. But I also thought it made the story like, when I first heard the story of the Aeneid, the writer Virgil, supposedly the teacher told me he was blind. And I was like, damn, how could some dude write this major like Greek classic and be blind? Like, damn, that's like a dope writer. And so I found out that he wasn't blind at all. But it was a really interesting way to kind of hyper mythologize the author. And so I kind of felt the same thing if I'm gonna commit myself to making this story, the great, the new Black myths, why not have the same thing be with me? Like, I'm making it on like 2 different continents. I'm digging up like, dirt that I'm gonna mill into like, an ink that's from the snow in Omaha, like the cold frozen sand, but it's from Malcolm X's like birth site. But in the idea that over time, when people keep telling the story, they're like, damn, this dude, he dug up Malcolm X's like birth dirt with a spoon in the cold. He traveled to Africa and painted part of the story. This story's epic. So building a kind of hyper mythology into it, so that when people go, well, yeah, that story is dope, because my work for sure relates to comic books. But the reason why I didn't go into making comics is because comics couldn't do certain things that paintings could. And then once I started doing painting, it introduced me to this whole other history about representation that I could also kind of grapple with, But for me, I think like, oh man, like it still would be kind of cool, just like the comic book, where it's like, I am kind of telling these like certain kind of moments that you're like, what's happening there? I don't know what that moment is, It's like, because it becomes more versatile than just like your straight reading the comic book. Yeah. So I think that's what kind of made me think about this kind of format more, because it could kind of flip into all kind of stuff in different ways.
Yeah. So there's one last question before we head out for the day. It's, I think, from Facebook. How has your work changed as a result of Black Lives Matter moving to the mainstream here and internationally?
I think making Black stories more putting them on the table, so they're not marginalized. They're becoming more of a central story. I think there was a writer that visited Notre Dame one time when I was teaching there, and they had a great way of kind of talking about African-American kind of history, and they talked about his world history. That, there's parts of the world that wouldn't be developed if it weren't for cheap slave labor that we provided early on in the world's history. And by having our stories be more centralized, I think it gives a broader understanding of history. So that's really the importance of Black Lives Matter. We're in some ways, the movement is focusing very much on disparity and inequality, but by just moving the camera towards us, it now sheds light and starts going to open up a space where you could hear more stories about African Americans. and here and those stories start to be again more central as opposed to be marginalized, right? And we could also see more of a variety of the stories too, so they're not all just like the ones of like the brutality, right? You know, and recognize that our story is part of world history. It's not just, oh, it's just like the hood, it's just the guy, it's just like the story of like slaves, because that's not even it. Because the reality is the story that we have to tell are people who are actually the survivors, not the slaves, because a lot of slaves died.
Right.
You know, so we're all the people who survived. So it's not that story.
It's not that story.
No. It's the real deal.
Well, thank you so much, Naeem, for talking to me today and for being part of the program. I just want to leave you with one. We have a comment from, it looks like, I'm guessing, one of your students, Emily Tian. I hope I'm
a good friend of mine and fellow instructor at Oakland School.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, the students at OSA are very lucky to have such a skilled artist to be their teacher. Really love your works, Naeem.
Thank you, Emily. You were awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate you guys taking time out to hang out with me today.
Oh, and I guess, yes, the very final thing, apparently someone on Facebook is asking you to show the piece behind you. So really quickly before can you talk a little bit about that painting?
Sure. Actually, this is funny. When you were asking me here, and I'll see if I could pull back just a little so you could see that. There's a little bottom piece, and then you could kind of get a little closer. So really quickly, my mom is a fashion designer. So I grew up in a household with my dad who's a sculptor and painter, and my mom was a fashion designer. I love fashion stuff, but also the bravado of hip hop fashion. Always loved it, man. The dookie chains, everything. And remember earlier we were talking about artifacts in certain ways that they also kind of increase the mythology, right? Like between reality and myth, like especially if you have the location or the knuckle bone of a saint. That's the shoe that was supposed to be maybe the boot of like the John Henry character that I use. So it's like, it's got like alligator skin, it's got like snake skin, like all the like skins, you know, it's like the things that, you know, like the super ill Versace luxury boot kind of. And so it's a kind of an example of some of the eccentric fashion that I also build into my own paintings, you know, and again, kind of referencing hip hop and Black fashion, like the originality and the bravado and the
Dapper Dan.
Totally, straight up. I mean, those are that. I mean, when I looked at Dapper Dan stuff, like back in the day with like Eric B and Rakim, the covers of the albums with the like the Gucci stuff, man, I was just like, yo. I mean, my head exploded. I was just like, what? Because also too, my mom was making original fashion like in my house. So I knew that Black artists were capable of amazing. I was just like, yo. So for me, yeah, it's a little bit of an expression. So this is a boot. So this is the one that I want to do 3D, like make it 3D, like sculpture of and all that.
Well, that'll be exciting.
Yeah, it's totally cool.
Yeah, when that finally comes to fruition. Well, I want to thank you again. This has been a great, fantastic conversation. Thank you for continuing to be part of MOAD and and for showing up.
No, thank you guys so much for reaching out to me. I really enjoy all the programming that you guys do, and you're a really great institution. I really appreciate the support that you give all the Black artists here in the city. Really, it's amazing. So thank you so much for clearing out a space for me to kind of share what I do.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who watched today. If you want to share this talk with anyone you know after the program is over, it'll be, all of the programs will be loaded onto our YouTube channel at a later date. And tune into In the Art Studio every Wednesday at 1 p.m. So and with that, have a great day.